Alright guys and girls, in this quick little video that I'm going to have you watch right now, we are going to be going over the second E1, the second E2, and the concluding sentence of the ERQ that we were just working on together in class. So you have this exact paper that you see on the screen in front of you on your desk right now. I'm going to be talking you through this, giving you some hints, some tips, some tricks as you're working on this. But please make sure that anything that I put on my paper that you see here on the screen, you also need to be writing it with your pencil on your copy of the paper. So make sure you have your pencil ready to go. And let's talk about what to do for the rest of this ERQ. So like we've already talked about in class today, what we are doing with this ERQ is we are explaining how the main idea of this story is developed or created or shown throughout the text. Back at the beginning, when we filled in our answer, we said that the main idea of this passage is that human experimentation is necessary, which is what our first E1 and E2 was about, but that it hasn't always been done in an ethical way. So since our first E1 and E2 was talking about how or why human experimentation is necessary, remember we talked about Dr. Edward Jenner and how he created a vaccine, which is something that is necessary for us today. Our second E1 and E2 is going to talk about how it has not always been done ethically. I have given you most of your sentence starters here, so all you guys are doing is going in and filling in the blanks. So for this E1, here's what we have so far. To further develop the main idea, the text goes on to give several examples of human experimentation that were done unethically. For example, and this is where we have to go back to the passage and we have to find some evidence. When we go back to the text, we are looking for a piece of evidence that shows that human experimentation sometimes was not done in an ethical way. In fact, it was done in ways that were very harmful and really hurt people. So for that, you need to flip your paper, your passage, I should say, over to the back, and we're going to focus on the section, the Nuremberg Code. Now, in the beginning of this section, it starts to talk about the Holocaust and Nazi doctors and how they would experiment on human patients in ways that were very unethical. In fact, it was basically considered torture. So, there's lots of different pieces of evidence that we could pull out here. Anything that you could find on the back side of the page that is an example of how a patient was treated in a really horrible way, especially in terms of human experimentation, would be a good piece of evidence to use. But we're going to focus on the second paragraph here. I'm going to read just a little bit and we're going to stop and we're going to see if we can find some evidence. So it says, under the guise of medical research, patients, remember that word is in quotations because they weren't really patients, they were prisoners, were subjected to unimaginable horrors. In one experiment at Dachau concentration camp, prisoners were forced to sit in tanks of freezing water for hours before undergoing various treatments for hypothermia. I'm just going to go ahead and stop because this is already a really good piece of evidence that we could use. It does give us an example of human experimentation, and it's an example of something that obviously was unethical. You can't just make people do this. It is considered torture. So I'm going to go back to my copy of the ERQ. I'm going to be typing it in on my screen. You can copy off me. Remember, you can pause the video if you need to, or you can copy it off of your own paper. We are citing textual evidence, so I have my opening quotation marks here. And again, I am going to copy what we found in the text. So it said, in one experiment at Dachau concentration camp, prisoners were forced to sit in tanks of freezing water for hours before undergoing various treatments for hypothermia. And since I am citing this from the text, I need to make sure that I have my opening quotation marks at the beginning, and then I added my closing quotation marks at the end. Again, guys, anything that I put on my copy, you need to make sure you write on your copy, and if you need to, pause the video now so that you can copy this piece of evidence. All right, we're going to move on to the E2. So remember, the E1 is written straight from the text. So we copied this quote straight from the passage. Our E2, we are putting in our own words, and it's going to be at least 2 sentences long. So I've given you a sentence starter here to get you started. It says, this evidence demonstrates. Remember, what we talked about just a minute ago was that we were trying to find a piece of evidence of unethical human experimentation. So human experimentation that was done in a horrible, horrible way. So when we say this evidence demonstrates, basically what we're going to tell our audience is that this was one of those examples. So we're going to put, this evidence demonstrates one of the many examples of unethical, because remember that's what we were trying to prove, human experimentation. There were other pieces of evidence we could have used, so this was just one of the many examples of unethical human experimentation that was talked about in the article. Our second sentence, we need to think about, after it gave those examples of unethical human experimentation, there was a solution that was eventually created to help with the unethical human experimentation that was taking place. So again, I've given you a sentence starter here. It says, as the text explains, it wasn't until the creation of blank that human experimentation became more regulated. You may have to go back to the text to refresh your memory on what was created, but if you look, it's literally written in big bold letters here, the Nuremberg Code, the Nuremberg Code. So if we go back to the passage right here, it says, as a result, the Nuremberg Code was written, outlining 10 points of ethics that should be followed when conducting medical research. So remember, before the Nuremberg Code, there were no rules, there were no laws, there were no regulations about human experimentation. And people realized after World War II that that was a big, big problem. So they created the Nuremberg Code so that there would be some guidelines that people had to follow. So in our next blank, we are going to put, as the text explains, it wasn't until the creation of the Nuremberg Code that human experimentation became more regulated. So we have our 2 sentences, and we are ready to move on to our concluding sentence. Remember, the job of the concluding sentence is really just to wrap up your paragraph. So these details and examples helped to clearly portray blank. Remember, if we go back to the question at the very beginning, the question that we are asking is, how is this main idea developed throughout the text? So the whole point of this was we were explaining what is the main idea, how is it developed throughout the text. So these details and examples clearly help to portray or show us the main idea of the passage. I'm going to remind you guys one more time that your paper should look like my paper. All of the things that are written in red on the screen, you should have written in pencil on your paper. So please make sure your paper looks like my paper. And once you have done that, you are finished with this assignment for today.